Well, we're in a series on the ties that bind us together. What happens when those ties break? Especially when it comes to the next generation. We've heard stories of deconstruction, deconversion. Some of you, this is very personal. How do we create ties that last from one generation to the next and the following after that? Well, I got a question for you as we start this morning. It's this. How do you view your role as maybe a parent, a grandparent in the church, in terms of passing on your faith to the next generation? Because you and I are here because someone passed on the faith to us. I teach full-time at Biola University, but I taught for 21 years, part-time and full-time, at a private Christian school teaching Bible in Southern Orange County. And I'd ask my students a lot of questions, and I was always interested in their responses. But here's a question I'd ask them over the years. Again, Christian school. More than anything else, what do your parents want for you? You know what the number one response was? My parents just want me to be happy and successful. That's right. Now, I have 3 kids, and I want my kids to be happy and successful. But I would much rather have them be miserable failures in the eyes of the world and following Jesus than the reverse. What does it look like biblically to do that? Well, to frame our conversation this morning, I want to draw your attention to Psalms 127:4. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior, so are the children of one's youth. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior, so are the children of one's youth. I understand we're building a student center and expanding to have a lot of vision happening in your church, but let me tell you and remind you that the greatest resource this church has is the next generation. That when you and I are gone, Lord willing, they are living and proclaiming and advancing the kingdom of God. So biblically, what does it look like to create binds across generations? Well, we're going to turn to the book of Deuteronomy. And keep in mind, the book of Deuteronomy, before we turn there, will be in chapter 6. Deuteronomy was a speech by Moses to the nation of Israel, who he had led out of slavery, had been shepherding them for 40 years through the desert. They're about to enter into the promised land. But he can no longer go with them because of his unfaithfulness. And they're not going to have a pillar of fire by night and a cloud by day to direct them. Everything's about to change as they settle into the land. He gives them this speech, and you can make the case that this passage we're going to look at is the central passage of the Old Testament. And we'll unpack that. But we'll start in verse 2. So Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 2. Deuteronomy 6, verse 2 says, that you may fear the Lord your God, and all you, your son, and your son's son, by keeping all his statutes and his commandments. Now, what's interesting about this is it says these are commandments for you and your son and your grandson. What's fascinating is God is starting this nation of Israel. He doesn't just say, hey, here's commandments for you as you move into the land. He's saying, I'm giving commandments for you, so this faith is passed down to your kids and your grandkids and all the generations after. That's kind of a different way to think about our life, isn't it? Rather than saying God gives me X number of years, God calls me to be faithful here because my faithfulness or lack thereof will echo for generations yet to come. I shared when I was here a few weeks ago about my father. Some of you will recognize the name Josh McDowell. He's celebrating 6 decades of faithful ministry this fall. 85 years old. My father grew up in about as broken of a background as you could imagine. His older sister took her own life. My grandpa, my dad's dad, told him when he was younger, he said, you know, you were a mistake. We didn't even want you. His dad's dad was a town drunk in a small town in Michigan, so you constantly live with that shame. And he was abused by somebody on their farm in a way I will not describe because I see kids. But it only stopped when he slammed the man against the wall when he was 13 years old and said, if you touch me again, I'll kill you. And he meant it. At that stage, my dad tried to disprove Christianity, prompted by some Christians. Ended up, God got a hold of his heart and transformed him. If you ask my dad today what he's most proud of, he won't mention the books and the speaking and all the things he's accomplished. He'll say, you know what, my kids and my grandkids are following the Lord. When God gives a hold of one life, I mean, it echoes for generation after generation after generation. That's the backdrop of this passage in which Moses gives this passage called the Shema. And it starts in verse 4, but you can make the case that it's the central or most important passage in the Old Testament. You could make that case. So when Jesus is asked what's the greatest commandment, he actually cites this passage. Orthodox Jews today will still recite this passage twice a day. So Deuteronomy 6, verse 4, let's dive in. And here's what it says. It says, "Hear, O Israel," or "Listen, Israel. Yahweh is our God, Yahweh is one." Right away, there's a principle I think we learn. It's this: to make God the Lord of your home. Make God the Lord of your life and God the Lord of your home. Because the question is not, is something Lord of your home? The question is, what is Lord of your home? Now, I'm guessing all of you had the same experience I had where you sent a text or you put something on social media, and the moment you sent maybe that email, you wish, you know what, I would like to have that back. I'd like it redo on that one. Well, a few years ago, I was landing at the Orange County Airport, and I was pulling my bag down, and I looked ahead a few rows. One of my good friends was on the same flight. I'm like, oh my goodness, I'll text him so he stays after and we can talk. So I texted him. I said, hey, punk, turn around. I'm right behind you. And I sent it to my mom, who was home alone reading at night. She wrote me back word for word. She goes, hey, son, I think you got the wrong punk. Well, I tell you that because in 2010, I had my first public debate on a college campus in Southern Orange County with a PhD who's a high school teacher on the question of whether God or evolution best explains morality. And you might remember the story. He was recorded, someone recorded him under the desk, and it was covered by the O'Reilly factor. He said, you got to take your Jesus glasses off to see the truth. And we debated this, and shortly before, a girl sent me a note, and she said, hey, would it be possible to interview you before this? I said, sure. And then I got another email from her. I'm thinking, why is she sharing this with me? And I realized she didn't mean to send it to me. So she comes over for the interview, and when it was done, I said, hey, I'm not a counselor. You sent me this email, and I read it thinking it was for me. Do you want to talk? She goes, sure. We're talking, as I remember, just anger and rebellion and frustration and pain in her life. She goes, all that's true. In fact, I was in church last week with my parents, but what they don't know is I don't even believe in their God anymore. As I just listened and asked her questions, essentially she said, I have a hard time believing in a loving personal God when my own father's been such a workaholic. Do you see what Moses is saying? Make God number one. Because when we make God number one, our other priorities start to fall in line. Now you say, well, how do I really know if God is Lord of my home? Well, there's two ways to check. Pull out your calendar and pull out your checkbook. If you don't know what a checkbook is, ask someone over 40. In other words, how you spend your time and how you spend your money reveals what we really value. Jesus said, where your treasure is, there your heart is also. In fact, I think kids have somewhat of a sense that when there's a crisis or something goes wrong, they're watching their parents or grandparents or important adults in their life saying, how are they going to react? Do they really believe this? So I was driving pre-kids, so this is 20 years ago. My oldest son's a sophomore at bio, at least 20. So at least 20 to 22 years ago, I was going to speak in the mountains outside of Fresno, about 4 to 5 hour drive, with a pastor. I don't remember his name or almost anything we talked about, but one thing that happened I'll never forget. We're somewhere in the middle of nowhere in the 99, and he's driving. All of a sudden, this loud screeching noise comes from his car. And instantly, I'm like, oh, man, we're going to break down. We should have left earlier. I should have driven. I'm thinking, God, I'm going to speak at a Christian event. You're not going to let me get stuck here. Like all the problems are going through my mind. We pull over, and the pastor looks at me, no hesitation. He goes, let's pray. I see problems as opportunities to trust God. And I sat there so convicted. I was like, man, compared to this guy, I'm like a spiritual raisin. I was so convicted, but I thought, he really believes this. When the chips are down, so to speak, mild crisis, let's trust God. First thing Moses says, if we care about the next generation, make God Lord of our life and make God Lord of our home. But then he goes on in verse 5. It says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. In other words, love God with what? This is the participatory part of the program. Love God with what? Everything. Love God with everything. Now, why does it matter that you and I love God? By the way, before I answer that, notice, Moses is talking about creating ties that bind us across generations. But the first thing he doesn't say is fix kids, fix their social media, fix their attitude, change them. The first two things deal with adults. Our instinct is to look at the next generation and say, they do this wrong. Moses is like, yup, actually look in the mirror first. Number one, make God Lord of your home. Second, love God with everything. Why? Because kids tend to follow the passion of their parents or their grandparents or other significant adults in their lives. So my son, he was here in the last service, brought some friends, which is pretty fun. When he was 7 years old, I was driving him to school, and I thought, I'm going to ask him a question. I said, hey, buddy, what do you love? He goes, well, in football, I love the Chargers. By the way, they're playing right now. Do not tell me the score. Don't come up to me afterwards and tell me the score, even if you're a Steelers fan. I don't want to hear it. He goes, in football, I love the Chargers. I said, well, what else do you love, buddy? He goes, in basketball, I love the Clippers. I said, okay, what else do you love? He said, well, in baseball, I love the Red Sox, and I hate the Yankees. Now, what's funny is that he gave those three answers because in our family, we hate sports. Yeah, you don't believe that, nor should you. My wife's dad coached football for years and actually got us to love the Chargers, and we watch and root for them. Fun family tradition. Why did my son say he loved the Clippers? Because both my wife and I were college basketball point guards, and by the way, I know exactly what you're thinking. You don't look like a basketball player, which proves only one thing. There must be a God. Why did my son say he loved the Red Sox? My mom is from Boston, and I mean, she's drunk the Kool-Aid of the Red Sox. Even if they're not playing, she's checking her phone, and it like makes her day if the Yankees still lose. Now, I didn't have to sit my son down and say, hey, in our family, we love football. Hey, in our family, we care about basketball. Hey, in our family, we love the Red Sox and hate the Yankees. I didn't have to tell him that. He just saw his mom and his dad and his Grammy getting excited about these things, prioritizing these things, and naturally picked up that passion. So keep in mind, my son only plays basketball. About shortly after this conversation, I said, maybe he was 8 or 10, I said, hey, buddy, if you could go to a sporting event with anybody in the world, what would it be? He goes, I think I'd go to a Red Sox game with Grammy. I said, why? He said, because she just loves the Red Sox so much. So he graduated 2 years from high school, and my mom flew him all the way to Boston with her to go to a Fenway game, get this, where the Red Sox beat the Yankees. Do you see what Moses is saying? Love God with everything because the next generation is watching. What do you get excited about? What do you talk about? What are you enthusiastic about? Is it the Lord? Because if we want the next generation and they're not enthusiastic, the first thing we should do is look in the mirror and ask if we've cultivated a loving relationship with the Lord. Moses goes on in verse 6. He says, and these words that I command you today shall be in your heart. Now notice, here's commandments, here's truths. You can't compromise these. But it's not about the commandments. The commandments are to be in our heart so we live them out in relationship. If I was going to give a different talk on how to not pass on the faith, I think step number one would be, in a simple word, legalism. Make it about the commandments. Make it about the rules without it being in the heart and showing why we follow those rules and fail to connect it to relationships. Whether it's on my YouTube channel or personally or with other people, I have conversations all the time with people who've left their faith. And a common thread that I hear is it was about the commandments, it was about the rules, it was legalistic, it was never in my heart, and I didn't experience it in relationship. I think perhaps one of the most helpful and profound things my dad has said in ministry is this: rules without relationships lead to rebellion. Rules without relationships lead to rebellion. Moses says, we've got rules, we've got commandments, but it's not about the commandments. These commandments are to be in our heart, so we live them out. That's why Jesus said, if you love me, you'll obey my commands. One of the most famous artists, Vincent van Gogh, grew up actually wanting to be a pastor. Couldn't become a pastor because he wasn't able to master Greek in his denomination, but he became a missionary, and from accounts we have, he would just go minister to people working in the mines, to blue-collar folks, and ministered to them. But he came up before the mission board to have his license renewed and was denied for two reasons. Number one, they said, Vincent, you're not a good enough preacher. Number two, they said, your appearance is unbecoming of a minister of the gospel. Clearly, they hadn't read the story of John the Baptist. Well, falls into depression, and then letters start popping up of him wanting to be an artist. I think he maybe only sold one painting in his life. Now, the secular narrative is that he abandoned his faith. I'm not sure that's true. He had psychological issues, but I think he kept believing in God, but would sometimes use his art to critique the church. So I didn't include a picture in this, but literally just Google Van Gogh church. It's a painting of a church building with no doors. How interesting is that? But perhaps his most famous painting, A Starry Night, you've seen this, but you know the backstory of it. By the way, I actually have a rendition of The Starry Night in my office. I love it. I bought it hand-painted at a market in Rosarito. I walked out and there was a big smudge on it. I was like, hey, do you possibly have another one? He goes, no problem, I fix it. Gets a Sharpie and paints over my Van Gogh. He's like, you're fine. I'm like, I guess you're right. That's what I get for buying it at a market in Rosarito, a Van Gogh. But it's up in my office, and I love it, and I see it because the meaning behind this painting. Now, our eyes are drawn to the sky, right? It's vibrant, it's active, it's dynamic, it's moving, because Van Gogh believes Psalms 19:1 and 2, that the heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hand. Day by day they spew forth speech. Night by night they display knowledge. Yet you look in the valley, what do you see in the middle of the valley? A church. What do you notice about the church? The lights are off because God is alive in nature, but the church is dead. Moses is saying there's commandments we have to follow, but they are to be in our hearts and we are to live them out in relationship. It's not about the commands themselves. That's legalism. Then Moses actually tells us, all right, here's commandments. Here's how you live these out in relationship. And here's how you create ties that bind us together across the generations. So verse 7 says this: you shall teach them diligently to your children, and you shall talk to them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise, when you get up. In other words, talk about God when? All the time. All the time. Now, why would it be important that you and I talk about God all the time? Well, here's the way I frame it. It's this. Principle number 3 is to make God part of the rhythm of life in your home. Make God part of the rhythm of life in your home. Refuse to compartmentalize our faith. Now, this is even more important today than when Moses wrote this, because we live in a secular dominated culture. Now, what does that mean? Basically, secularism says you can believe in God, you can worship together, you can study the Bible, but please kindly keep it in the privacy of your home and the privacy of your church. Secularism says you have the freedom to believe in God, but it shouldn't affect your business. It shouldn't affect the way you think about entertainment and culture and education, and it certainly shouldn't affect the way you vote. Secularism encourages us to privatize our faith. Now, without realizing, I think in Christian circles, sometimes we buy into what's called this secular sacred divide. So I teach at Biola, love it, but I remember when I went there in the 90s as a student, we'd have a chapel at the end of the year. So imagine Biola's gym, if you've been there, maybe 2,000 students. And we would have students stand who are going on mission trips for the summer to commission them. I mean, students going to faraway places like Africa, Australia, China, Texas. I can pick on it. I was born there. And then they'd have students, we'd pray for them, worship, message, chapel was done. I always remember thinking, why are we only having students stand who are going on mission trips? Why don't we have students stand who are going to work in construction for the summer or going to intern in a business? Isn't that a mission field? Now, I think we've made an amazing shift where part of the theme of Biola is literally think biblically about everything. So I co-host a podcast out of Biola. We call it the Think Biblically Podcast. And the idea is, how do we think biblically about art, about science, about history? In fact, we do a weekly cultural update. We take 3 or 4 stories from the week, and we say, how do we think biblically about this? How do we think Christianly about this? Now, why? Abraham Kuyper, a great Dutch politician and philosopher and theologian, said, there's not a square inch of creation out of which God does not cry out, it's mine. It's mine. You see, Christianity is a holistic worldview that should shape the way we think about and live in all segments of life, but our secular culture says, privatize it. 3,000 plus years ago, Moses is like, nope, make God a natural part of the rhythm of life. Now, how does this translate to our kids? Studies show that as a whole, kids tend to adopt most of the beliefs, in particular political beliefs, from their parents. As a whole, that's the case. Now, most parents don't sit down and say, hey, in this family, we're liberal. Hey, in our family, we're conservative. Here's what you should think about tax policy. Here's what you should think about Middle East. Here's what you should think about abortion. Parents don't tend to formally do that, but what happens? Driving in the car comes up in conversation. Sitting at the dinner table comes up in conversation. And through the rhythm of life, kids just kind of absorb how to think and they develop political views. That tends to be how it happens. So I want you to think of something important to you. And maybe some of you like to golf. If you like to golf, do you have a rule in your family that says we talk about golf Saturday mornings and Tuesday nights? No, if you value it, when do you talk about it? All the time. When do you talk about God with your kids and your grandkids? Because if you just talk about it Sunday after church, maybe Wednesday night after Bible study, if that's it, whether you intend it or not, you're sending the message that God can be privatized to that area of my life, but doesn't affect everything. That's in part why Moses says, and we'll unpack this, talk about them in the home. In other words, talk about them over the family meal. And here's a photo coming up, by the way, that represents no family in the history of family meals. This from an article a number of years ago called The Magic of the Family Meal. And they talked about at the time that more and more American families were carving out time to have meals together. And I think this was even shifted into higher gear during COVID. And they said, actually, the studies are clear. Kids that regularly just dine with their parents or significant adults, less likely to be involved in high-risk behavior, more likely to do well in school, have a positive self-image, healthy relationships, and so on. But what they said in the article interested me. They said there's something about a family meal where stories are told, jokes are laughed at, and the wider world is viewed through the lens of the family's values. They said even on nights when the food is cheap and the talk is fast, it instills in kids a sense of belonging, a sense of identity that you're a part of something bigger than yourself. And that's exactly right. Now, I travel some. My son's in college. My daughter's a senior in high school. Like, we can't sit down every night, but we carve out as we can that time to just be together. Now, I'll be honest with you, we don't have formal family devotions in my family. Some of you might be disappointed. You're like, wait a minute, I read your dad's family devotionals. I don't use them. You're welcome to. But what I do is try to weave in naturally an answered prayer, something I'm studying, a conversation amidst all the other things we do to get my kids thinking about faith. But one rule we have is when we sit down to have a meal together, technology goes off. I'm not anti-smartphone, anti-iPad, anti-television. I use all those in different ways. But turn them off and just be present and see people face to face. Unless the Lakers are playing, because you don't want to be legalistic, right? You know, another way I try to do this with my kids is my son, he's 20 years old, my oldest. When he was 14 years old, he wanted to see that movie that was new at the time about the rock band Queen named, oh, now you participate. No, I'm just kidding. Named Bohemian Rhapsody. Told the story of the rock band Queen. And I'm like, he's 14, it's PG-13. There's probably going to be some things I don't love. But I thought, you know what, buddy, I'll take you and a friend, and I'll spend $100 on tickets and popcorn. If when we're done, you'll just talk to me about it. I just want to know what you think. He goes, sure, Dad. So we go to the movie with a good friend of his. We come back, sit down at the dinner table, probably 20 or 30 minutes. I said, hey, what'd you think? What was your favorite scene? Did anything surprise you in the movie? As Christians, is there anything in this movie that we can celebrate and agree with? I said, were there any ideas coming through this that gave you pause? Did you ever feel like the movie was preaching at you? And in relationship, we talked about it. That's in part what Moses means when he says talk about them in the home. Second, he says when you walk along the road. In other words, when you travel, do you redeem the travel time? Now, there's times where it's like, put your headphones in, take a nap. Sometimes it's a quick ride. But I started thinking when my kids were younger, how could I at least create some conversation about spiritual things and redeem the time at least somewhat? So I came up with this super creative name. You're going to love it. You're welcome to use this for a game. And I call it the question game. I know, really proud of that. And the idea was I would take my 3 kids and ask them age-appropriate questions, and we would keep score because they're all super competitive, which they totally got from my wife. And then we'd have a conversation about it. So we'd ask them questions about science, questions about history, maybe spelling, maybe math, and I'd ask them questions about the Bible or about faith. Part of the thinking is when it comes to science, there's truth and knowledge in science. When it comes to history, there's truth and knowledge. When it comes to math, there's truth and knowledge. When it comes to God and the Bible, there's truth and things that we know about God. It's not just opinion. So I know that 2 + 2 = 4. I know George Washington was the first president of the United States. I know water's H2O. And I know that Jesus has risen from the dead. That's one of the reasons we would do this. So we keep score, we go back and forth. Sometimes I'd look at my wife, I'm like, that was awesome. Sometimes I'm like, that was a disaster. But when we started, my daughter, she's 17 right now. She was a senior in high school. So when you're 3 and you're playing this game and you want to ask your 3-year-old a spiritual question, the answer to every question has to be Jesus. Exactly. You've played this game. Well, so I'll never forget. I don't remember where I was driving. I'm driving down the road, and I can see my daughter in the rearview mirror right behind me, strapped in her car seat. And it was her turn. Going to ask a spiritual question, so I decided to mix it up this time. I said, Shauna, where do we go when we die? Without any hesitation, he looks me right in the eye through the rearview mirror and says, jail. We're still working on her theology. But it's a way to create conversation. The third one, he says, when you lie down. There's something for many kids at the night where their hearts are just open and receptive to conversation, prayer. Now, with my kids at times, we've read C.S. Lewis's Narnia. I've read with my kids at night, like The Hobbit, other books, pray with them. But one thing in particular I try to tell my younger kids, or my kids now when they were younger, was this. I'd say, you can ask your dad anything. Now, why would I say that? Because kids are not primarily going to their parents with questions. They're not going to their pastor. They're not going to the teacher. They might be going to their friends, but most of them are asking questions to TikTok, YouTube, and now through artificial intelligence. I want my kids to know that they can ask me anything. I'm not going to shame them. I'm not going to freak out. I'll respond. If I know, I'll give the answer. If not, I'll invite a conversation. You can ask me anything. Now, if you say that, your kid asks a question, you go, why did you ask that question? You've just shut the conversation down. So I was talking to my son, and he's 7. I said, hey, buddy, you can ask your dad anything, right? He goes, okay, Dad. I'm curious. Who is Jesus praying to in the Bible? I said, well, what do you mean? He said, Jesus is God, right? I said, yes. He said, the Father's God, right? I said, yes. My 7-year-old looked me in the eyes and he said, was Jesus praying to himself? I said, go ask your mom. I did my best to explain the Trinity to a 7-year-old. I was at a school a number of years ago when I was teaching a high school Bible full time, and this mom came up to me somewhat like frantic. She's like, oh, Mr. McDowell, I've been looking for you. My second grader, who's probably 7 or 8 years old, asked me a question, and I don't know the answer. Can you help me? I said, well, sure. What was the question? She said, my second grader asked me, did God love Osama bin Laden? I said, oh, that's easy. She said, really? I said, yeah, it's simple. So I leaned in and I said, here's what you say. What do you think? I'm dead serious. A question is almost always better than an answer. A question is almost always better than an answer. Aren't you at least curious why a second grader is troubled by who God loves and who God doesn't love? Do you know in the Gospels and the book of Acts, we have 340 questions that Jesus asked? The letters of Paul, there's 262 questions. The God who made us made our brains to respond to questions. Jesus told stories and he asked questions. Go back to the garden. Who told you that you were naked? Questions, questions, questions. Now, this doesn't come naturally to me. I'm a professor. It's my job to have answers. But I've learned to ask questions. Now, why especially is this so important? If there's any faith that should be okay with and should invite questions, it's Christianity. Number one, Christianity is true. But number two, the Bible invites us to ask questions. Jesus said, love God with your heart, your soul, your strength, and with your mind. Isaiah writes, come let us reason together. God writes that, says that. How about in Genesis 18? Abraham reasons with God about the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah. What's so interesting about this is it's not questions and doubt that tends to hijack a kid's faith. Let me say it again. It's not questions and doubt that tends to hijack a kid's faith. It's unexpressed questions and unexpressed doubt that tends to hijack a kid's faith. I can't tell you how many heartbreaking stories of people who've deconstructed to the point of deconversion, who say, I had questions, I had doubts, wasn't taken seriously, was shot down and my questions weren't invited, and eventually I just didn't feel at home anymore. It's okay if you don't have the answer. When kids say they have doubts, I'll say things like, wow, that's okay. Like, tell me about it. What questions do you have? Where did this come from? Half of what we need to communicate is part of having faith might also mean you have questions. It's okay to have doubts. God is big enough. Let's go find an answer together. So you create a culture with your kids and in your small group and in your family that questions are not only okay, but they're good, and that we can seek an answer together. Last, Moses says, when you get up, in other words, the morning. By the way, if you're not a morning person, don't beat yourself up. The point is not that you have to do all of these. The point is this is a pattern of the kind of way we should be engaging our kids and our grandkids. He says, when you get up. But there is something about the morning. I'm a morning person. I love it quiet in the morning just to think and get my mindset for the day. So for years, I go on a Wednesday morning to local Starbucks, which, by the way, I call $8 now, for reasons you obviously understand. And I didn't have class till 10 or 11, so I go there early and I'd study and I'd just work on stuff. And I remember one morning I saw this grandfather with his grandson who was maybe 16 years old. Bible was open. Week after week after week I saw him talking about a biblical view of money, biblical view of relationships. I was watching this and it just really started to impress me. I was like, wow, this grandfather is taking at least every Wednesday morning his grandson before school and spending $8 on coffee and donut, maybe more, and just mentoring his grandson through the scriptures. I thought, I wonder how different my classroom would be if every kid had a grandparent or an uncle or parent. I wonder how different your church would be if every young person had an intentional Christian making that tie with them. How different would our state be? It would literally turn the world upside down. So I don't remember how I worded it. I sent out a tweet, an X, with something to the effect of watching this grandfather week after week over coffee mentor his grandson through the scriptures before school, something like that. One of the comments that stood out to me was, I wish I had a grandfather like that. I'm convinced that the heart of this generation is to be called the beloved. That's the heart. You might look at certain words and antics and the way this generation dresses, look at social media and be turned off by it, but I invite you to look at it through the lens of what's the heart cry behind this. And a lot of it is, do you see me? Do I matter to you? Will you like and comment? Because that tells me I'm important and I matter. This generation, because it's true of every generation, is to be called the beloved by a caring adult who says, you matter to me. And I'm going to show you that. Some of you might be listening to this going, okay, Sean, I wish I had heard this years ago. I could have raised my kids differently and maybe they'd be following the Lord. And maybe some of you are like, Sean, this is old news. This is what I did in my family and my kids aren't following the Lord. Here's my encouragement. Number one, realize that God's heart is more broken than your heart and my heart could ever be. Jesus wept over Jerusalem. But second, please give yourself grace. At the heart of Christianity is grace. There never has been and never will be a perfect parent. There's one person who could have been. His name is Jesus, but despite what the Da Vinci Code said 20 years ago, he wasn't married and he didn't have kids. Give yourself some grace. But maybe this morning is an encouragement to keep praying, to take baby steps to rekindle that relationship if you have a kid or grandkid not following the Lord. Friends, this generation, largely because of smartphones and artificial intelligence, faces more challenges than I think any generation in recent times. It's quite literally all hands on deck. If it's helpful to you, I didn't bring any books this morning, but I wrote a book with a former atheist cold case detective, J. Warner Wallace, just called So the Next Generation Will Know. And we walk through, this talk was like the beginning of just walking through how to do this practically. If you're looking for a resource, that might help for you. that's out there. You're like, I need this right away. Well, it's fine because Amazon will literally deliver it to you this afternoon on a drone. In sum, here's what I think the research shows. If you want to pass on your faith to the next generation and create ties that bind us together, there's really three things to do. Number one, model a faith that kids find attractive. If you're not living an authentic faith, not a perfect faith, but an authentic faith, it doesn't matter what we say or how many times we bring our kids to church. Make sure God is Lord of our life and Lord of our home. Second, build relationships with our kids and our grandkids. Build intimate, close, warm relationships with the next generation. And third, have spiritual conversations, not lectures. Spiritual conversations in the rhythm of life with the next generation. There's no guarantee, but this is what the studies seem to show and the scriptures teach about how we can create ties that bind across the generations. Amen. Father, thanks that we have a church here at Friends that cares so much about following you in the next generation. I do pray if this talk was just maybe hurtful for some people, that their kids are not where they wish they would be or they had some regrets, that you would just cover us with your grace, renew our passion for the next generation, and just give us wisdom how to move forward restoring those relationships. God, we pause and give you thanks that somebody passed on the faith to us and ask us to do it with the next generation. We pray this in your name. Amen.